Hey everyone, Nick from ResoNix Sound Solutions here with another video on the Audiotec Fischer DSP PC tool. This software is used to, control all the Helix, Brax, and match processors. And today we are going to be going over something pretty simple. I'm actually surprised I never made a video on this, and I get inquiries about this pretty much every single day. So I figured it was about time to make a video on this. We're going to be going over the Helix Conductor Controller settings and configuration. So that is the controller that Helix offers as a programmable controller for all of their modern processors. Just note that this doesn't work for every one of their processors. All of their older ones that do not feature ACO co-processing, this will not work with. This will work with all of the newer stuff, such as, the Pro Mark III, the Ultra S, it works with a lot of them. You just have to make sure that, it's compatible with your processor. So anyways, how we get into configuring this is really simple. We go over to the DCM tab, and once we are in the DCM tab, we have the extended features, which will normally look like this if you're just opening the software for the first time or you don't have one set yet. Now, what you're going to want to do is, click this drop down, choose the conductor, and you're going to see a pretty intense menu for all sorts of options. So we're going to run through this in a very simple way. First, I'm going to run through what the different options are and give a little explanation about them. And then I'm going to run through it again based on how I set things or what typical use cases are or when you would want to do various situations. So anyways, let's get right into it. So first thing we have here is the main menu. You'll see that right up here. Most of the time, you're going to have it set to volume control, which is the default. You can choose volume control, tone control, signal input selection, sound setup selection, and Bluetooth playback control. These are all options that you can choose as your main menu. Not going to get too deep into this right now. Again, I want to explain everything first, just so I don't explain something that leaves you a little confused. I'd rather just explain to you what the different settings are and make our way through. After that, we have our automatic switch back to main menu. You can either enable it after 5 seconds of inactivity or you can disable it. Personally, I like to leave it enabled. What this means is if you go to a different menu on your conductor, after 5 seconds of not touching or changing a setting on the knob, it'll revert to whatever your main menu is, whether it's volume control, tone controls, or anything of that sort. Then down here, these are the different options that we can populate into our conductor menus. Default is just to have, obviously, volume controls. That is not an option in here. Those are pretty much standard and you actually control them down here. But you will have other menus, tone controls, you have signal input selection, you have the sound setups, which is DSP presets, and Bluetooth playback control. These are all different menus that you can add or unadd or whatever it might be. So yeah. Below that we have LED brightness, which you can change right in here. Then you have LED dimming after 8 seconds of inactivity. This means if you are adjusting your knob on the conductor, oh, that sounds weird. If you are adjusting the knob on your conductor, after 8 seconds of not adjusting it, what do the LEDs do? Do they stay as they are? Do they turn off? Do they reduce brightness? Personally, I go LEDs off all the time. Installation orientation, this is just the degree of rotation you want the LEDs, just in case you don't get the installation perfect or you have it angled or any which way, you can rotate the lights to match your installation. Below that, we have volume control configuration. If you read down here, each volume can be configured individually in type, color, and range. If a volume is not required, it can also be deactivated. So volume 1, volume 2, volume 3, and volume 4. as you can see, default is master volume, subwoofer volume, and then deactivated or disabled. You can change these in any which way you want. So for the assigned volume control for volume 1, actually let me explain this first before we get into these. The reason these are just called volume 1, 2, 3, and 4 is this is the order that they will appear in the menu. So if you have your default for the main menu set to volume control and you have master volume set as your volume 1, that means master volume will be your default position for your conductor. That's good for those of you who are using an external source, such as a digital audio player or a Bluetooth like a HEC card or USB in or anything of that sort. But if you have a volume controller built into the car, whether something like you're using a aftermarket radio or if you're using the stock radio, in those cases I like to set subwoofer volume as first. And actually we just saw something there. If you already have a specific volume assigned and you try to do it in another one, you will get a little warning. So you will first have to, disable that, change this to subwoofer, and then you can do whatever here. That's how you switch those around. And then you can also add, subwoofer volume, digital input volume, auxiliary 1 volume, auxiliary 2 volume, and rear attenuation. Master volume is controlling the output of all of the outputs no matter what source you are on. It is just raising and lowering the gain on the outputs. Subwoofer volume is lowering or raising the gain on the subwoofer virtual channels. Whatever you have assigned with subwoofer virtual channels are the channels that are going to be adjusted by subwoofer volume. Digital input volume, this is only going to control the digital input. HEC volume, same thing, is only going to control the HEC volume. Same thing here. Rear attenuation, this is going to control the volume of the virtual channels that you have set to rear left, rear right, and rear fill. It's only going to affect those channels. It's actually pretty neat for those who are using rear fill. Yeah, pretty straightforward. Now, assigned color. We can make this any color we really want. They have basic colors, or you can sort of do whatever you want. There are, it's full RGB and you can kind of pick whatever. It's pretty easy to dial this in to whatever matches your vehicle or whatever you really want it to look like. Let's say it was something like a deep blue, but it wasn't very bright. You can always reduce the output as well. That's the, I think that's the level of intensity. I don't know the exact definitions of how RGB works, but again, you can get any color here that you really need. And you just assign it just like that. Pretty straightforward. And you can assign all sorts of colors. Now, just a heads up, volume 1, 2, 3, and 4 are the only ones that you can change the colors for. The tone controls, the signal input selection, the presets, the Bluetooth playback control, those are all pre-assigned. I'll go into a little bit more detail later. Tone controls, these are interesting. I actually like using these. This is actually what in my car I have set to as my main menu. And what these are, it gives you bass and treble control. It can do boost, it can cut. So this is nice. I like to use this because it keeps, it makes this low end or top end adjustment on the entire system instead of just on the subwoofer channels, which is typical for just the subwoofer volume control. When you raise a subwoofer volume or lower a subwoofer volume without introducing the same change to your mid-bass drivers, you actually throw off the crossover, which messes up phase and can kind of make the system sound out of whack. When you do it with tone controls, you can set what frequency you want it to. You want it to start adjusting. It's just a shelf filter. Both of these are just shelf filters, low shelf filter and a high shelf filter. Unfortunately, you cannot adjust the Q of those filters, the bandwidth of the filters, but essentially what this is doing is, if I set this to 120 hertz, that means it means it's applying a low shelf filter of 120 hertz with a Q of what I think is 0.707 to the entire system. That means if there's, rear subwoofers, a front subwoofer, mid-bass drivers, or anything in between, it's just applying that shelf filter to everything in the system, which will keep phase cohesion between every single driver. It will not throw off any of it. This is really nice. And it also is a quick and easy way to dial in pretty much any song. Frankly, I really only add 1 or 2 dB or cut 1 or 2 dB depending on the songs. Once you have a system that's really dialed in, that's all you're really gonna need. I think I have mine set to 100 hertz, sometimes 110 depending on what I'm doing. For high frequencies, it's the same thing, but on the top end. I set mine to, I think, 2000 or maybe 2500. And again, this is just a high shelf filter that is set to a Q of 0.707, and it applies that high shelf filter to the entire system. So it could be just your tweeters or your tweeters in mid-range or your wideband driver, whatever is in the system that will be affected by this filter is going to have that same applied filter on. And it's really, really nice to have. Once you have a system that's really dialed in, just raising the subwoofer or lowering it by like a couple of dB is noticeable. Like, oh yeah, we gained a little bit more bass, but you can tell that like something's up. When you use the tone controls and it, applies that same filter to everything, keeps things linear, keeps things in cohesion, and you don't really notice those changes as much, besides just having more output or less output in the selected ranges. So yeah, that's pretty much the explanation of each one. Now we're gonna dive into like typical use cases and how they go. Again, let's start up here at the main menu. We have volume control, tone control, signal input selection, sound setup selection, and Bluetooth playback control. Frankly, I cannot picture these bottom 3 ever being used as the main menu. I don't see why you would ever. Signal input selection, I very rarely even use this because you can set up signal input selection to be automatic. I think there's only one case where I would really do that, which would be switching from optical to coaxial input, because I think you can only do that with presets, and you might be able to do that with this, but I haven't even really bothered to use it because it's such a rare use case that I just don't think it's necessary. Sound setup selections, again, how often are you changing presets that you want this as your main menu? Personally, again, I've never had it set to that. I can't even think of a situation where I would want that. And Bluetooth playback control. This was somewhat not commonly used, but when I was doing installs that featured the HEC cards, the Bluetooth HEC cards, the conductor does have the ability to do next track, back track, play and pause and stuff like that. But it's a little cumbersome on the conductor, but not even really that. It's just, again, it's so rare that you really need your conductor to do that. I think it's, I don't know. If I had one of these in my car, I probably wouldn't even have it activated, let alone set as the main menu. Now, focusing on the 2 that are possible. Volume control is definitely what you're gonna suggest if you have an external source as your main volume, your main source, or even as a secondary source. And the reason for that, again, is you're gonna wanna set your volume 1 as master volume, and because the last thing you want is, even if it's your secondary source is an external source, when you're using it, the last thing you're gonna wanna do to adjust the volume is have to go, press the button once or twice or whatever, just to lower or raise your volume. You're going to want it to be right there, ready to go at a moment's notice without having to fumble or do anything. But if you have a source that already has a volume controller, again, such as an aftermarket head unit or your stock head unit, I personally, in those cases, at least in cars that like I know the customer understands what these are and can actually benefit from them, and in my personal car I have this, I set it to tone controls. And that's because, again, I use my steering wheel and, steering wheel controls for volume and track forward, back, pause, or on the screen, whatever. And the only thing I really need to use the conductor for mostly is to raise, low end volume or dial back the treble a bit. And so, yeah, I keep this as my main menu. And again, if you even want to have the option for it, you can have it right here. You can turn it on, you can turn it off, whatever you really need to do. Again, all of these are not standard. The only one that is standard as on is the sound setup selection, which is the presets. And yeah, you can even turn that off if you want. Now, going down to the other section, which is the LEDs. LED brightness. The first batch of conductors a few years ago, the LEDs were super bright and you had to rock them at like 5%. And even then, sometimes it was too bright. The newer ones, which if you're buying one today, you have no chance of getting one of the older ones, so don't worry about that. But for those of you that happen to have one from like the initial batch of conductors from years ago, you're gonna wanna set this low. Even today though, with the dimmed down smoked LEDs, I still don't think I set it above 20%. It's still pretty bright and is still plenty to see in the day, but the problem is not during the day. The problem is at night. If you start getting too bright, it is honestly a little ridiculous when it's dark out. So I suggest 20 or 10 or even 5%. And again, the LED dimming activated after 8 seconds of inactivity. Again, you adjust something on your conductor, and after 8 seconds of not touching anything, what do you want your LEDs to do? Some customers want the LEDs to dim. Me personally, I want the LEDs off. Most customers want them off as well, but you can sort of set it to however you want. You can have it stay 20%, if you set it up here to 20%, you can have it set to 20% brightness at all times. You can have it set to LEDs turn off after 8 seconds of inactivity, or 10% or 25, 50, 75, whatever. Again, I prefer LEDs off. Install orientation, again, this is just to help, it'll just rotate the LED position based on how you have it installed. Usually you only really need to use, 180 degrees or 0 degrees. But there's, again, they give you every option here. Especially since, I don't see how you would need it, because it's not like you can install this any which way. It's not like a keyed product. It's just a circle, Actually, there is one little keyed portion of it, but it's just a little bit of plastic that you can just trim right off, and which I usually kind of do. But again, you can rotate it any which way, super easy. Volume control configuration. Again, we kind of went over this. I probably went over it a little bit more than I said I was going to, but I think I covered it. Again, if you have an external source, I would be very confident in saying that you want your master volume as the volume 1. And again, that's just because you want to be able, excuse me, I gotta drink some water quick. In these situations, when you have an external source, you want to be able to, control your volume at any moment's notice without having to press a button just to get to that main volume menu. And then second one could be subwoofer volume. And then third one, depending if you have any of these other ones, Even in situations where I can do digital input volume control or HEC volume controls, I still never really use them because master also controls that. So it gives you the option in case your setup is very complicated and whatever. But again, 99% of the time, you're just going to have master volume and subwoofer volume. And if you have rear speakers, you can have rear attenuation. Now, from there, again, we already went into the colors. Pretty straightforward. You can select whatever you really please. Now, volume control range. This is one that most people don't recognize or realize. Let me go into the options here. We have a 60 dB swing in half dB steps, a 60 dB swing or range, sorry, in 1 dB steps. We have a 24 dB range in half dB steps, and we have a 12 dB range in half dB steps. What this means is, conductor all the way up only means that it is not attenuating volume. It means it's allowing full volume through the processor. When you reduce the volume on your conductor, it's actually just limiting output. It's not raising output as you turn it up. It's actually just limiting output as you turn it down. So this means if you have it set to 60 dB range, that means it will allow you to turn the volume down by 60 dB from the highest, full output setting. And you can go in half dB steps or 1 dB steps. Personally, for master volume control, I set it to 60 dB in 1 dB steps. I find half dB steps very unnecessary and also makes you use your conductor more, which will wear it out quicker. So I like to use 1 dB steps. Again, 1 dB is plenty fine enough for master volume control. Startup volume, you can limit your startup volume so you don't get blasted with volume the second you sit in your car. So it can limit it. Like if the system turns off and then turns back on, the max it will be could be minus 15 dB, minus 30 dB, minus 45 dB. Personally, I leave this disabled usually. Again, very rare situations would I want this, but they give you the option for it. Now subwoofer, again, you can select the same thing. Personally, I select 24 dB in half dB steps. Subwoofer does call for a little bit more fine adjustments, so half dB is nice. And I've never seen a situation where you need a full 60 dB of range on your subwoofer. That's just silly, frankly. And 12 dB, I don't know, I feel like it's just a little less, but to be honest, I almost never touch my subwoofer volume adjustment since I use the tone controls, which only go up to 6 dB, but something in my head still tells me I personally like to set it to 24. What I'm getting at is I'm realizing as I'm doing this video that I'm a crazy person and I'm just selecting it because I have OCD and I want to do the same on every single one, but I can easily get away with 12 dB range at half dB steps. Rear attenuation, same deal, pick whatever you really want. I personally, I think I usually go with 24 dB in half dB steps, or actually no, and for this I go with 60 dB in 1 dB steps. And again, same deal, you can limit all of these. For subwoofers and rears and whatever, I would never really limit it to minus 15 because that means every time you get in your car, you would have to change it back to what you really wanted if you wanted it above any of these settings. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Now again, tone control, I already went over it. Low shell filter, high shell filter, really nice for just those fine, not really fine, but like adjustments on the fly. These really should be the only things you ever need to touch, and only by a couple of dB in either direction once your system is properly tuned. You'll find that once you have a properly tuned system, you really don't need to make adjustments even based on like song to song to song. You're just gonna find like, oh, I'm in a mood right now and I want a little more bass. Or rarely you'll get songs that are just a little hot or a little, little lacking in bass. So yeah, you could turn it up a little bit and adjust, on the fly. And that's pretty much it. And then what you do once you configure your conductor, how you're going to save it, you just click save And that is pretty much it. You can name it Conductor 423 2024. And that's really it. Actually, we do have one more thing. We do have the RTC, which stands for Remote Tone Controls. The RTC enables a volume-dependent tone control, which is dependent on the set master volume. This allows to change the tonality in dependence to the set volume. For example, to create a loudness characteristic or to react to certain volume-dependent sound changes. What this means is this is a separate tone control that is based on, sorry, I was playing with this before. But what this means is this sets tone controls based on your master volume setting on your conductor. So essentially you can dial in your own loudness feature. This is, believe it or not, like some people might be looking at this like, oh, like that's stupid or whatever. Believe it or not, I think this is really neat. If you're familiar with the equal loudness contour, you'll realize human hearing changes based on sound pressure levels. Our human hearing frequency response changes. And, you know, we shouldn't, in theory, need to change anything because technically accurate is accurate. But for preference, you know, if you've ever tuned a system and, you know, whatever, you'll realize, oh, like at high volumes, things sound great, but at lower volumes, like the bass almost seems a little lacking. This is a nice way to, you know, to get some output, some extra output in the bass department when your volume is set low. So how you can do this is, you know, at low volume, you can set your bass to like plus 8 dB and your gain at high volume to be, you know, normal. And this means, you know, your threshold for low volume could be, you know, minus 40 dB. This is like very quiet listening. And your threshold for high volume could be like minus 10 or minus 5 or wherever. And this will mean that in between these volume settings, this shelf filter will change based on where you are in the setting. It's not just going to be an on or off, it's going to change gradually. So you're not really going to notice it. And again, you can change this frequency to be whatever you really want. You can change it to be anything that makes sense for your system, for your preferences. And same thing with the top end. In my car, what I notice, again, this is pretty much any car just based on how things work and how human hearing works. This is probably how you're gonna really want it set. You know, bass with on the low end being raised a little bit. You know, when you have your volume low, you're probably gonna want the bass up a little bit. And then your high frequency configuration, let's do, again, I like to use 2000 or 2500 Hertz is where I feel, I've played with this a little bit, that's where I feel it really is like the sweet spot for treble control. We can do, now actually, let me just throw this out there. I've actually never used this feature before. This is relatively new and I haven't had the time to really dive into it. So I'm literally doing this and showing you this on the fly right now. But I'm showing you how I would set mine up first to give it my first go. Now in the high frequency configuration, gain at high volume, you know, we maybe want to knock it down like 2 dB, threshold being 10, and you know, that's pretty simple. I think this is really how I would set it. But you can do all sorts of things. You can make your high volume gain on the bass, you know, lower than normal. You can do the same thing, do the opposite here. You can do all sorts of stuff with this. And again, you know, you'll see once it's green and lit up, that means it's active. And, you know, you can turn it off, you can turn it back on. You can do anything you really want with this. So yeah, I think that pretty much sums it up. If any new features for the conductor come out, I will be sure to make a new video that explains them, or, you know, add on a video that explains them. If you have any questions that maybe I didn't cover or didn't explain well in this video, feel free to ask in the comments. Again, I kind of made this video on a whim, super quick, didn't even write down any notes. I just jumped into this. But yeah, feel free to reach out if you have any questions, and you can purchase the Helix Conductor and all other Helix products right from the ResoNix store, as we are now the only authorized dealer in North America that is allowed to sell to internet customers. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions, any concerns, any comments, or if you even want to request a how-to video about any of the hardware or the software. So yeah, thank you for watching and stay tuned for more.